Since 2014, members of the Cannabis Research Center have been documenting the expansion of cannabis agriculture, first in the North Coast and now in other parts of the state. Using a combination of satellite data and publicly available database, we have put together data sets documenting the location of over 10,000 permitted and non-permitted cultivation sites in California. While our database does not cover the entire state, it has provided several insights into land use in cannabis agriculture.
We started looking at this in almost 2013. And at the time, we just wanted to know how much cannabis was out there, and we wanted to try to put some data to it. So we started counting all the farms. How we do our research is we start with satellite data, and you can actually see the cannabis farms. So if you get the right data, and this is all freely available data, you can look down and you can identify what a cannabis farm looks like. And in some parts of the state, of course, there's many of these farms. And what we did is we simply documented these. We put on a map where these farms are. Most of the farms, when you see them on the landscape, it'll be a small hole in a natural landscape. So you'll see a forest and then you'll see a little hole, and where that little hole is in the forest, there'll be a cannabis farm. And these will be really small. These will be maybe the size of a lot that a house is on or something like that. They're not big clearings, they're often very small clearings. Years ago, before Prop 64, most people were growing for the medicinal market. And within that, most people like to keep less than 100 plants because there is federal legislation that made it an offense to grow more than 100 plants. That was a felony. And so a lot of people grew 99 plants. And so that was really common. We would count the plants and there were 99. And because they were growing 99 plants, they would make each plant as big as possible. So they'd grow these huge trees. What's happened with the new legislation is that cannabis farms are permitted by square foot. So now you need to grow as much cannabis as you can in a certain amount of square feet. So rather than have huge plants, oftentimes people now are having small plants packed very tightly together. And so the number of plants has probably changed. We probably actually have more plants, but smaller plants on the landscape, would be my guess. But everybody does it a little bit different. So in California, cannabis is grown on nearly any type of land. Historically, cannabis was grown in the North Coast on areas that were originally forested. Oftentimes these areas, the forests were cut down and communities would come in and sort of try to restore the land, and one of the ways they did that was through cannabis farming. In other parts of the state, especially now, cannabis is being grown more commonly on agricultural land. So especially on the Central Coast, those communities have chosen to sort of put cannabis on areas that are also used for traditional farming and ranching. Most cannabis farms are sort of located on medium-sized parcels, so somewhere between 5 acres and say 40 acres. And usually on that farm, only a small percentage of it is actually cannabis. Because the actual amount of area for cultivation is so small, the farm oftentimes has forest on it, or rangeland, or some other type of land use besides just cannabis. The main difference between most cannabis farms and other types of agriculture is that cannabis farms are really small. So even large cannabis farms are small relative to large other types of farms. The biggest cannabis farms I know of are perhaps 40 acres, with most cannabis farms less than 1 acre. Relative to other farms, that's tiny. So far we haven't seen threats from cannabis that are different from other agricultural crops. The main thing we have seen is that cannabis farms are located in different areas than most types of agriculture. And related to this, there might be some environmental threats. So cannabis farms are sometimes located far from paved roads, in remote areas with steep slopes, sometimes close to streams. And in these areas, we need to use really good environmental farming methods if we want to make sure cannabis isn't impacting the environment. From sort of a scientific perspective, we haven't really been able to document them yet. We know that many cannabis farmers, through surveys we've done, have a real strong environmental ethic. So many cannabis farmers are trying to work to make the environment better. We don't, and I don't think any other scientific group has yet documented sort of how this actually works in the environment. When we've done surveys with cannabis farmers, most farmers self-report that they do use environmental practices, even those farmers who are not permitted. For permitted cannabis farmers, if you're permitted and following the law, you're probably acting with some fairly high level of environmental stewardship, because the regulations are fairly strict for cannabis farming. So one thing that we've noticed, especially in historic growing areas, is that cannabis is clustered. So if you find one cannabis farm, oftentimes there's more cannabis farms nearby. So when I started doing the research, we really just wanted to know how many farms there were. how much was out there. And we have a good sense of that now. And the numbers are impressive. There's a lot of cannabis and probably more than I would have expected. But what's been really interesting as we learn more about cannabis, I've realized that some of the ways we worried about the environmental impacts of cannabis may have been overstated, and some of the ways we worried about it may have been understated. And so what that's shown to me is we need to continue to do research, especially at the scale of the individual farms. We have to understand what's going on the farms, what are the techniques that really work well, what are the techniques that don't work well, and that's going to really help guide cannabis to be an environmentally sustainable crop in the future.